Hi there, people. Welcome to the Book Nook. This is a nook where I review books. Even though I've done book reviews before where I'm not in the Book Nook, this is the Book Nook, so just get used to it if you're not used to it already. That said, let's get into today's topic, which, of course, is David Foster Wallace's thick, big honkin' novel, Infinite Jest. So, I got given this copy by a fan of Nicholas Comics. Thanks for the free copy of Infinite Jest. I definitely wouldn't have gone out and bought this, but thanks for that. So, I read through it. I set aside some time and went through all the pages of this. Obviously, I didn't know much about, David Foster Wallace. I had heard about this book, and, obviously, whenever I hear glowing reviews about any type of book, as is the case with, Peter Heller, we did a review on about, about a year and a half ago at this point. Whenever I hear glowing reviews about a book, I'm initially skeptical. Well, I can't say my skepticism was founded exactly, because this isn't the worst book I've ever read or anything. It's definitely not the best. This is not the greatest book I've ever read. And as far as the genre of postmodern fiction goes, I don't think Infinite Jest even really comes close. I've read much better examples of the type of thing David Foster Wallace is trying to pull off here. It's a fun book. I can say that. You'll have fun reading it. But it's not amazing. It's not like a transcendent literary experience where you'll go oh my gosh, this book changed my life. This book has changed the way I see things. It's not that kind of book. I would put Infinite Jest in the same class as My Custom Van by Michael Ian Black. It's not amazing. It's not great or anything. Nobody looks at this and goes, "Ah, yes, high literature." Or some people might, like they do with Infinite Jest, but it's just pop entertainment. It's just junk food for you to just gorge out on, and if you have nothing better to read, you want to kill some time, you're on a long flight, or waiting at the airport or whatever, this is the kind of book that just fills up the time. It's basically like the Quibi of books, It's a good time filler. It really fills up some time. I spent about a month reading this through, and by the end I was yeah, I spent some time on this. So let me give you my explanation as to why this book really isn't that great. Again, it's competent, it's not great. So the main character, of course, is, what's his name? I forget all the names of these characters because, of course, David Foster Wallace feels that one of the main defining characteristics of postmodern fiction is to give every character an unnecessarily quirky or wacky or goofy name. We got Harold Incandenza, we got a character named John Wayne, but the joke is that he's not the normal John Wayne, he's Canadian, and the joke is that he's not the American John Wayne, he's a Canadian John Wayne. David Foster Wallace, despite this being heralded as a case of American postmodern fiction, and Mr. Wallace himself being American, this book tends to have a weird fixation with Canada, which is strange for, an American type book. But I guess something about Canada just really speaks to Mr. Wallace for some reason. Infinite Jest takes place in a hypothetical near-future scenario wherein, we've annexed some land to Canada, or Canada has annexed some land to us, and I just don't get this type scenario, and I see it in fiction a lot, where we go to war with Canada, or we try and take over Canada, or Canada tries to take over us, and it's this is never going to happen. The Canada-America border works because it's nice and straight, and it's like the straightest border in the world. It's just from coast to coast and easy to follow. Nobody would just give land to Canada, and we wouldn't try and invade Canada. Because, I mean, let's be honest, what resources even are there in Canada? Most of it is inhabitable. I mean, there's pretty moose and stuff and beautiful national parks, but you can't, like, develop apartments or anything up there, so, like, what's the point? Also, I don't think Canada would ever face enough overpopulation that they'd want to expand down here. They got, like, 5 million people. That's a minuscule type population. So really, it's just a really stupid plot that I see in a lot of stuff. Specifically, Image Comics' We Stand on Guard, a good example of a comic that just tries to frickin' paint this futuristic American-Canadian war scenario. It's like, Canadians don't go to war, okay? They just don't. They barely have an armed forces. Like, come on. I think part of the appeal of this sort of plot is that, like, it's like a subversion of expectations. Like, yeah, you'd never bet that Dudley Do-Right would be warring with you, but here it is. It's Canada, and it's freaking intense. Get ready for the Canadian War, bruh. But, like, the last time we even considered invading Canada was freaking 1812, and nobody's considered it since. It's just not worth it. Like, what's Canada have to offer? It's just America, but with less democracy. Well, what's so great about it? What's it got really on hand that we could use? Not that much. Right off the bat, that's a really stupid development. There's this group of, like, French-Canadian, Quebecois, wheelchair-bound insurgents. So that's just a really stupid idea. Right off the bat, obviously, Canada would not annex any of America because most Americans don't want to suddenly be Canadian, and most Canadians don't want to suddenly be American. I think in either case, nobody would want to suddenly be living in a state or province that's not Canadian or American if that's what they previously were. It just doesn't make any sense there. In addition to that, we have the concept of teleputers, which are basically like TVs, but they're also computers. I guess that's kind of happened, what with like how you can get streaming content on your computer. But on the other hand, it's established that in this near future scenario, so everyone watches stuff called entertainment cartridges, and basically these are like DVDs or VHSs, but they're fancier, and I guess they work through lasers, which that just doesn't really work, because this is supposed to be a sci-fi novel, so I expect some new way of being able to watch entertainment besides just popping in a physical cartridge. Like, if this book had predicted streaming all the way back in 1996, I might be impressed. But it doesn't predict streaming, it just predicts a newer format than VHS or DVD. So, really nothing too crazy there. Essentially, it just kind of predicts Blu-ray. It's not called Blu-ray, obviously. So yeah, and there's like teleputers, which are televisions / computers. If you read this book and expect like science fiction, it's not science fiction, it's postmodern fiction, obviously. This book is kind of like what I assume a like high schooler might write after an introductory course to postmodern fiction, which is probably about the age range David Foster Wallace was in when he wrote this. Just like, hey, I've read some Kurt Vonnegut, now I can write Kurt Vonnegut too. But, you really can't, because you're not Kurt Vonnegut, and you're not Thomas Pynchon, you're just David Foster Wallace. You're just, you're not any of those guys. So this is kind of like, almost like a parody of a postmodern novel. Like, it just takes all the all the most, I guess you'd call them, conventions of the genre, and stuffs them into as many pages as possible. I mean, people have said this book is pretentious. I wouldn't label it as such. I think to qualify as being pretentious, you have to have the goal of being pretentious. I don't think David Foster Wallace is trying to be pretentious per se in this book. I think he's just trying to write a postmodern novel and not being very good at it. And, that's okay. At least he gave it a try. Everyone tries something. Heck, you can try all 31 flavors of Baskin-Robbins ice cream if you want to. So we got Harold in Cadenza, and we got Mario in Cadenza, and we got the whole in Cadenza bunch. And the whole book, David Foster Wallace is trying to endear us to this quirky family which does crazy stuff. Like they call their parents himself and the moms, just wacky stuff like that, because everyone in a postmodern novel has got to be this off-kilter eccentric with like so many neuroses, and they're so different you just wouldn't understand them. It gets old kind of fast. Obviously, Infinite Jest is compared to tomes like James Joyce's Ulysses or Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. Even on the back cover, it's like, the next step in fiction. Edgy, accurate, and darkly witty. Think Beckett, think Pynchon, think Gaddis, think. So, comparing himself to some pretty tall orders there. Well, he didn't write this quote. Sven Burkertz at the Atlantic Monthly did. But I really wouldn't say this is even close to like Gravity's Rainbow or Crying a Lot 49 or anything like that. I'd also say David Foster Wallace really doesn't exude the kind of aura you need to become a successful postmodern type author, like Thomas Pynchon, who hasn't made a public appearance for the entirety of his literary career. He's the sort of fellow who really lends himself to your imagination. David Foster Wallace looks like he's like a guy you'd go out for a beer with at happy hour, and then he'd order the bloomin' onion, and he'd be like, "Hey, you want half of this?" That's the kind of vibes I'm getting from David Foster Wallace. I don't get the impression that he's especially passionate about literature. And, sure, his book is like 900 some pages long. The introduction says it's over 1,000, except it ends around like page 900, and it ends on page 981, and the rest is just footnotes, so it's actually not over 1,000 pages. And writing 1,000 pages is not that amazing. A lot of good novels are over 1,000 pages. I'd say that's a good length for a novel. Like Stephen King's It is over 1,000 pages, and it's a much better read, and I like reading it. But Infinite Jest is like, it's competent. Like if I read this, and it wasn't one of the best-selling books of all time, and there weren't hordes of rabid fans over this thing, I might actually find it, like, kind of charming. But, just the fact that so many people read this thing and go, oh my gosh, it's Infinite Jest. Like, have you never read Naked Lunch? And here's where the next part of my argument comes in, because I really wouldn't compare this to Pynchon or, like, Joyce or anything, or, Ulysses. I would compare it to Naked Lunch. Because what David Foster Wallace is trying to do in this book is clearly be the next William S. Burroughs, or, Hunter S. Thompson. Or like, say, I'm part of the drug world, man. I understand drug abuse and substance problems, and I've taken a bunch of drugs. Except in the introduction, it says that David Foster Wallace hasn't taken any drugs. And this is very obvious. David Foster Wallace might be the most sober individual I've ever read. Like, there is not a lick of marijuana in this. There's not a lick of any type of substance whatsoever. You can tell that when he wrote this, he was 100% conscious and aware of his surroundings. and he's probably never even gotten a DUI. Absolutely not on drugs, and yet he feels entitled to talk about substance abuse and substance use and be like, yeah, I'm the next flippin' Walter White, man. I'm out here and I know all these flippin' drug things, you know. And it just comes off as like really misinformed. There's this whole weird bit about how like this guy smokes so much pot that he gets the munchies for like weeks, and he has to shut himself in and lock all the doors and windows because, oh my gosh, here comes the munchies, and he feels so disgusting for smoking the devil's lettuce. Oh my gosh. Like, I get that this was 1996 and the public wasn't as informed about marijuana and all, but you know who likes reading postmodern novels and stuff? Stoners. So if all you do is insult them, then they're probably not going to like your book that much. You also have the bit where, like, this lady's in the hospital and she's so anxious and nervous, and all she's done is smoke some marijuana. And it's like, you know, smoking marijuana will calm you down. It doesn't make you uptight. Does David Foster Wallace even know rudimentary principles of the effects of marijuana on like the brain or anything? You do his research, or like he seems to think marijuana is like the worst drug possible. And there's this stupid bit where like there's some drug slang and you call weed Bob Hope, and you call the marijuana dealer up and you're like, is Bob there? And then the drug dealer will be like, Hope Springs Eternal if he has some weed. Despite being set in like the 2000s or 2010s, Infinite Jest cannot seem to wrap its head around the idea of marijuana legalization. Obviously, marijuana is still completely illegal in all 50 states, or 47 states, because I guess we gave some to Canada. I don't know if it was 47, maybe like 40, who knows. Not a plausible future scenario. And I would say that if you read this book thinking that it's like a prediction of the future, it's really not. It's more like a retro-futuristic version of the 90s. Like, it's just the 90s, but slightly technologically upgraded with a few more perks, and we've given some land to Canada, and you know, that's basically it. Like, it's not a futuristic novel really. It's more like a retro-futuristic novel for the 90s. I will say you don't see 90s retro-futurism as much, so you know, props for that. But Infinite Jest is absolutely not the sort of novel that makes me go, wow, this guy's so forward-thinking. This guy is really breaking new ground here. This guy is changing the landscape as we know it. Because, I mean, it just reads like, yeah, I'm in the 90s, and I think weed is the worst drug under the sun, and if you smoke it, you turn into a raging lunatic. And also, in the future, they're gonna use entertainment cartridges instead of DVDs or VHSs. You know, as a bit of a format aficionado myself, I don't think it really packs a punch in that department. As far as like the idea of, you know, media stuff goes, it really doesn't pack much of a punch. Another bizarre quirk of this retro-futuristic setting is how now, instead of using the Gregorian calendar, which we've been using pretty much since the Middle Ages, because, you know, it's an accurate way of determining the Earth's rotation around the sun, we name all the years after quirky things like Year of the Whopper and Year of the Dependent Old Undergarment and Year of the Tux Medicated Pad. I have a couple questions about this timekeeping system. First, what happens if these companies go bankrupt? You know, because like July can't go bankrupt, obviously. It's not a brand. Also, why does America just use this calendar and the rest of the world doesn't use the calendar? This seems like it's trying to say, on a basic and fundamental level, America is obsessed with consumerism. We buy too many things, so what if we just named our months after brands, because we're obsessed with buying things? Wouldn't that be crazy? But nobody would ever do that because it's freaking stupid. It just doesn't seem like an efficient way to keep time. I don't think anyone would really go for it, and to me it seems more like David Foster Wallace is just trying to get out of providing some kind of internal chronology for his universe that he's created. This way he can say, well, this isn't 2010 or 2020, this is like the year of the flipping Mintos. It just seems like kind of a cop-out, because, usually when you're writing about the future, you're expected to kind of make predictions about the future and what year it is and like how things progress in a given amount of time. But this way, who knows what year it is? It could be 2040 for all we know. All we know is it's sometime in the future, and America uses a calendar where all the months are named after freaking products, because consumerism, am I right? Just a very surface level observation David Foster manages to make here. A very empty, no meat on the bones type observation. That'd be like if I just made a dystopia where the main villain was just a big corporation, and it was called Wall-E. Yeah, deep shit. By and large. Wow, did you know consumerism is bad? Holy shit, I never thought about this before. Really breaking new ground here, David Foster. Heck yeah. So there is yet another weird little quirk about Infinite Jest, and that is, of course, the footnotes, the big collection of footnotes at the end. It's a bunch of footnotes, and it provides little world building for this world, and it's trying to do the same thing a lot of other postmodern type things have done. Like, obviously, House of Leaves has footnotes, and I've read House of Leaves, and it's decent. I like it more than this, I'd say, just because it seems like House of Leaves puts a lot more effort into its world building and makes some convincing, arguments for how its world operates and stuff like that. So I like House of Leaves more than Infinite Jest. Obviously, the footnotes are before House of Leaves. They're in a lot of postmodern literature. Pretty much ever since people realized they could make wacky footnotes, it's been a thing in postmodern literature. I even tried it once when I was trying to write a postmodern novel when I was 15, and obviously it's a cliche at this point. And I think it was a cliche by the point that David Foster Wallace wrote it. Going back to the Naked Lunch comparison, there are a lot of entries and footnotes where he's so and so drug is frickin' savage, it'll mess you up, man. Naked Lunch, such a good book. If you haven't read Naked Lunch, seriously, give it a try. It's amazing. It's really good. And you can tell when you're reading Naked Lunch that William S. Burroughs is on heroin. The book is basically a drug trip in itself. It is written from the perspective of a freaking deranged mind. It is like drugs on paper. It is the stuff that William S. Burroughs sees on his heroin trip. And obviously William S. Burroughs really experienced a lot, and a lot went into the creation of Naked Lunch. He was just naked and starved in this decrepit apartment in North Africa, and that's such a cool story. And it's wow, this is how Naked Lunch was created. And it really shows that the atmosphere and everything soaked its way into Naked Lunch. So Naked Lunch is cool because it has all these exotic settings, like the Interzone, you got Mexico City, all these descriptions of the back alleys and the scummiest parts of America. And you go down to South America and you have cool descriptions of the tribal rituals. And you go over to Africa and Asia and they all clump together in the Interzone, which is just one of the coolest realms in all of literature, and William S. Burroughs makes it sound so awesome. Part of the reason Naked Lunch is admirable is because it's diverse, and it takes a lot of influence from cool countries around the world, and says here's the interzone, and it's like a weird realm where all the cultures are in one big concentrated area, and you got the mugwumps. Who can forget the mugwumps? They're awesome. Little aliens that, like, you know, have proboscises, and it's great. It's great. It's a seriously great novel. But you can tell that William S. Burroughs was taking some drugs when he was writing it. And, you know, I don't mean to bash the guy. Like, if someone's a really good writer, taking drugs can potentially up the, like, weirdness of whatever book they're writing. And that's the case with Naked Lunch. It's a really weird book. You know, it's because he was actually on drugs. And David Foster Wallace really was not on drugs, and definitely wasn't in a cool place like North Africa when he wrote Infinite Jest. So the only other country that really gets mentioned all that much in Infinite Jest is Canada, which, you know, compared to, like, all the stuff Naked Lunch mentions, like frickin' Algiers and, like, you know, like Morocco and flippin' Chile, you know, like Canada, like, come on, it's not that interesting a setting. And this is much longer than Naked Lunch. Make no mistake, Naked Lunch is like 200, 300. This is 1,000 pages or 980 pages of just, like, America and Canada, the most boring countries. I want to hear about frickin' Turkey or Istanbul or somewhere cool that, you know, lends itself to a cool story that they'll want to hear. Part of the problem also, and I really don't mean to diss David Foster Wallace, because he seems like a well-meaning guy, but there's way too much shit about tennis in this book, and tennis fundamentally is like a really boring sport. And obviously David Foster Wallace only writes a bunch about tennis in this book because, as the introduction says, he's big into tennis. He's huge into tennis, but actually tennis is a pretty boring sport, and it's the kind of thing that I can definitely imagine David Foster Wallace playing. You know, he's definitely not going to be going into something eccentric like croquet or something. He's just going to go for tennis. You know, I don't mean to, like, typify anyone, but it's like writing a whole book about, like, lacrosse. You know, it's not the most interesting of sports, really. And, like, the extent to which it goes on and on about tennis just gets really, really boring. I feel the same about, like, chess. If there's a story about chess, get over yourself. You play chess, you play tennis, we get it. You're smart, or you have a trust fund or whatever. Okay, move on. So there's that. The novel is also not helped by the fact that the main characters, Harold Incandenza and Mario Incandenza, and there's another Incandenza, I forget his name, they all just kind of blur together. They all attend this, like, privileged tennis grad school, this preppy tennis academy, which is not the sort of setting that I much fancy. You know, again, going back to Naked Lunch, there's, like, laboratories full of, you know, diabolical mad scientists and frickin' drug dens, and you got the slums, and you got the inner zone, and there's, like, descriptions of drug addicts who just, like, eat their suppliers through, like, a nose tube or something. Weird book, like I said. But Naked Lunch knows how to make an interesting setting. All you get with Infinite Jest is just like, hey, what if I was at a prep school, a tennis academy, where I learned to play tennis with, get this, 40 other trust fund kids. Amazing. That's the kind of story that I really can sink my teeth into. That's the sort of setting that really lends itself to 1,000 pages. Just this tennis school where everyone learns to play tennis. Go tennis. Yay. Again, nothing against anyone who likes tennis, but like, I don't even think people who play tennis give this much thought to tennis or like professional tennis. The only tennis players I ever see just do it in the park is like an afternoon type thing, and then they leave and forget about it. But Infinite Jest just obsesses on and on about tennis and how cool all these characters are, because they're in this crazy tennis academy, man. It's the craziest setting. It's the flippin' tennis school. I would say Infinite Jest suffers from the same type of problems as Catcher in the Rye, a novel that I really don't like. And I don't mean in any way to say Infinite Jest is as bad as Catcher in the Rye, but it suffers from a lot of the same problems, like making all your characters these like upper middle class people with no struggle and no stakes and no problems in life, and it's really boring. If you've ever read Catcher in the Rye, you know what I'm talking about. The main character, Holden Caulfield, is one of the most boring, insufferable, whiny narcissists I think there's ever been in literature. I don't mean to say Harold and Condense is a narcissist. He seems a little more developed than Holden Caulfield. That's really not saying much, but Holden Caulfield is a pretty low bar to kind of raise yourself off of here if we're talking like, characters who learn something. All Holden Caulfield learns is that, that the ducks migrate in the winter, and there's a lot of graffiti in the world. He's also a big homophobe, which is really awful. And, Catcher in the Rye is an example of a book where the main character just suffers a bunch, and they don't need to suffer, because Holden Caulfield, the whole book is like a couple miles away from his family's house. But he just goes out into New York to freeze to death, and he doesn't even freeze to death. He just gets pneumonia and lives. And really, really boring frickin' book. I don't think Infinite Jest is boring in the same type of way, but it's like if Catcher in the Rye met Naked Lunch. It's like if they had an offspring together. And the juxtaposition between those two styles is really jarring. Like, on the one hand, you're trying to write this like, I guess, like slice of life, great American type story about, the American dream and like this typical, this type American family who's quirky and relatable. But on the other hand, you want to write like this dark, deep, Naked Lunch postmodern experimental extravaganza, and they just really don't mesh well. I mean, either you're writing like for the mass market or you're not. And I think Infinite Jest tries to write for both, and it just comes off as like a mess, because they're two different types of books. I really don't think David Foster Wallace really has much of a grip on like what makes a postmodern book like, just kind of different from any other book. In the introduction, it makes a lot of assumptions about what I, as a reader, will think of the book. Like, for instance, that I'll think David Foster Wallace is a drug addict, which I absolutely won't. I don't think David Foster Wallace has taken a substance in his life after reading this. I don't know, but I would not be surprised if he has never done a single joint. That's how this book reads. It's a very sober book. It's not the kind of book where, like, stream of consciousness, experimental Jack Kerouac shit. We're talking, we're not talking the electric acid Kool-Aid test. We're talking Infinite Jest. It's it's not the sort of book that is like on drugs. It's just not. It's not the kind of thing that you read it and you go, oh yeah, this guy was on some mind-altering substances when he wrote this. The other thing that's in the introduction, which is by Dave Eggers in September 2006, is that you'd come out of it thinking David Foster Wallace is like condescending, and that like he's just like a snob, which I don't think David Foster Wallace is a snob. And to have the impression that someone is being condescending towards me, I'd have to have the impression that someone has some kind of information or like insight or knowledge I don't have, and they're being smug about it. But like, I don't know who'd read Infinite Jest and come away with the impression that this guy's trying to condescend to them. This book doesn't make me think that he's trying to like talk down to me, and this isn't the kind of book that like is hard to read. Like, it's noted in the introduction that you can't really read it when you're multitasking. Yeah, sure, I'd say you can't really read it while doing something else, because it does have the kind of sentence structure where you kind of have to think, oh, this is a reference to something that was referenced earlier or later or whatever. But it's not like Naked Lunch, where like you can barely understand it, even if you're trying as hard as possible, because the author was on drugs when he wrote it. It's not like Naked Lunch. Like, you'll get Infinite Jest. You'll be able to read it. Like, you'll understand it. Unless you're, like, really dumb. Like, it's easy to read. It's an easy read. It's not a hard read like Naked Lunch. Like, Naked Lunch, you'd pretty much either have to know William S. Burroughs or be William S. Burroughs to fully understand what he's talking about. And I don't think William S. Burroughs is condescending. I just think Naked Lunch is a very cryptic and enigmatic text. I think Infinite Jest is like really, really not that hard to get through. And anyone who tells you it is probably just like faking it, because it's not hard to get through. It's a quick read. You'll breeze through it. It's fun. Again, I'm not going to say that this is like the worst book ever or something. I have said that after Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, American satire is pretty much dead. And this is kind of proof of that, because even though this is like the biggest American satire book of the 90s, it does not have like the same edge as the Beat Generation did. It just does not have the same like biting cynicism to it that American satire did before Douglas Adams came onto the scene. But it's competent. It's alright. There are some really annoying parts, like when David Foster Wallace tries to go into his black dialect, which is kind of insufferable when it goes on for like 2 pages, and he's just trying to write like he's an African American youth. I don't know what that's all about, but I'm glad that doesn't show up so much in books anymore. Even postmodern books, I don't think you should write from the perspective of an ethnic group you're not a part of, even if it's like as a dialogue or a monologue thing. Like, can you imagine if for half of Ulysses, James Joyce wrote from the perspective of like a Libyan or something? It wouldn't make any sense, because he's Irish, so he just writes from an Irish perspective, and that's perfectly okay. Infinite Jest is one of those books that you read it once, and that's pretty much all there is to it, and you absolutely don't need to read it, but if you do read it, then good for you, I guess. You've read it. Go read something else, I guess. Anyway, so Infinite Jest was not as impressive as anyone makes it out to be. And, I'd say my expectations were pretty much spot on with this one. Not the best thing I've ever read. Not close. And, the whole. I'm not even gonna spoil it really because there's tons of stuff in here. Obviously, it's over 1,000 pages, but at the end of the day, I think Infinite Jest should not be compared to anything more than My Custom Fan by Mike Lee and Black. It's just a goofy little like passion project that he just was like, hey, what if I was silly for a bunch of pages? Okay. So yeah, that's my review of Infinite Jest. If you liked it, then leave a comment. Tell me what you think of Infinite Jest. If you liked the video, then smash that like button and subscribe and buy some Nicholas comics. I will say that my comics are better than Infinite Jest by a pretty wide margin. Anyway, that's going to do it for this review. Sayonara, suckers.